The fluorescent lights hum like distant rotors, steady and mechanical, filling Cedar Creek Medical's pediatric ward with a kind of white noise that lets you disappear if you know how. Brooke Sullivan knows how. She's been disappearing for 5 years now, moving through these corridors in scrubs the color of smoke, her dark hair pulled back so tight it could draw blood, her hands steady as surgical lasers even when they're empty. The other nurses call her the ghost. Not to her face. Never to her face. They call her that in the break room when she's filling her cracked coffee mug, the one with a chip on the rim and a faded Army Ranger insignia that nobody asks about, and they wonder aloud how someone so young can work doubles back-to-back without flinching, without asking for overtime, without ever joining the Friday happy hours at the bar on River Street where they complain about their ex-husbands and their student loans. Brooke doesn't go to happy hours. She doesn't have a story that's safe to tell. The mug steams in her hands as she moves through the break room at 0600 hours, muscle memory kicking in without her thinking about it. That's the word that comes to mind, muscle memory. 5 years of 12-hour shifts have carved grooves into her nervous system, little tracks that her body follows without permission from her brain. She waters the dying succulent on the nurse's station with the same precision she'd once used to hydrate for lines in a medical tent outside Ramadi, giving it exactly 1 cup of water because more would drown it and less would leave it gasping. The plant leans toward her hand like it recognizes something in her touch that the other nurses don't seem to see. She lets her thumb rest on one of its papery leaves for half a second, the same amount of time she allows herself for sentiment, then turns back to the shift board where the morning assignments are already written out in Dr. Mercer's careful, controlled handwriting. 3 pediatric trauma cases. 2 post-op recoveries. 1 infant with failure to thrive who hasn't spoken to anyone except Brooke in 8 weeks. Mercer watches from his office on the 2nd floor, perched behind thick glass like a bird in a cage, and she can feel his irritation even from here. He doesn't like that the parents request her by name. He doesn't like that the children calm down when she enters their rooms, that her hands seem to know things about pain and fear that his residents with their fresh degrees and their shiny credentials haven't learned yet. Dr. Marcus Mercer is a man who collects credentials and degrees the way other men collect watches, and he's been billing phantom consultations to cardiac specialists while taking kickbacks from a medical supply vendor who's never set foot in this hospital. But Brooke doesn't know that yet. She only knows that his eyes follow her in the way a predator's eyes follow prey, not with hunger, but with calculation. The way someone looks at a problem they haven't solved yet. She tucks the mug into her locker, the one on the back row where the light doesn't quite reach, and presses her hand against the photo taped inside. 5 years old. Faded now. Desert heat has done something to the colors, making them look like memories before the moment's even passed. A woman in desert fatigues, Major Sarah Hayes, Medical Corps, the kind of doctor who actually gave a damn about her patients, is pinning captain's bars on Brooke's collar while laughing at something someone said off camera. Both their faces are the color of sand and sunburn. Both their eyes are the color of people who've seen things that don't have names. Brooke's fingers linger on the edge of the photo for exactly 2 seconds, then she closes the locker and the image disappears behind metal. Out of sight. The way everything about her has to stay. The morning shift starts like every morning shift starts. Rounds at 0630. Vital signs at 0700. Medication distribution at 0730. The children in the ward are a cross-section of broken things, a 6-year-old with acute leukemia who's learning to say goodbye to her hair, a 9-year-old post-op from a spinal fusion, a 4-year-old with asthma so severe he wheezes like a little bellows trying to keep a fire alive. Brooke moves between their rooms like water moving downhill, finding the path of least resistance, her presence somehow making the machines beep a little softer and the monitors glow a little dimmer. In room 7, she adjusts the 4 drip on a 13-year-old with traumatic brain injury, and the girl's eyes track her movements with recognition even though she hasn't spoken a word in 6 months. In room 9, she sits beside a mother who's been in the same plastic chair for 4 days, and she doesn't say anything, doesn't have to, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the only one who understands that words can break things that are barely holding together. The ER doors slide open at 0847, and everything changes in the way that only certain arrivals can change things. The man who walks through carries a child against his chest like he's carrying a classified document that can't fall into the wrong hands. He's tall. Built like the kind of military hardware that doesn't need to advertise itself. Captain Garrett Hayes, Army Ranger, first deployment to Kandahar in 2008, promotion to captain in 2013, wife died 18 months ago from complications. Brooke doesn't need to be told because she can read the story in the way he holds his son, with the white-knuckled grip of someone who's already lost the first person he loved and will not, absolutely will not, lose the second. The boy is 7 years old. 7-year-old Liam Hayes. Dark hair. Serious eyes. And his mouth moves but no sound comes out, hasn't come out since his mother died, and the pediatric attending physicians run their standard protocols, EEG, MRI, metabolic panel, lumbar puncture to rule out infectious causes, and they find nothing. They find exactly nothing, which is somehow worse than finding something because it means there's no machine to fix, no medication to prescribe, no algorithm that leads to resolution. Brooke sees them in the bay at 0852, and her hand goes instinctively to her jacket lining where the faded patch sits stitched inside the seam like a secret that could cost her everything. The patch is roughly 3 inches by 2 inches. Army Ranger insignia on black background. The kind of thing that shouldn't be here, hidden under layers of polyester and cotton, sewn with the kind of stitching that could hold through a hurricane or a hard interrogation depending on which way the wind was blowing. Her breath catches for half a second, exactly half a second, and then the professional mask slides back into place like closing a door on fire. She doesn't recognize him. That's what her brain tells her to do. She doesn't recognize him because recognizing him would mean remembering Ramadi, and remembering Ramadi would mean acknowledging that Major Sarah Hayes made her promise something standing in the shade of a concrete wall, with the sound of small arms fire echoing across a courtyard, and Sarah's voice steady as someone reading a grocery list, "Take care of him." 3 words. Take care of him. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Brooke moves toward the bay with her tablet already open, her expression already shifting into the neutral zone that keeps her invisible to most people. But Liam Hayes looks at her, and his eyes do something that eyes shouldn't do. They recognize her the way animals recognize predators, not with fear but with the kind of knowing that comes from trauma recognizing trauma. Like calling to like. Like one scarred thing seeing another scarred thing across a room full of people who've never been broken enough to understand. Dr. Mercer descends from his office with the kind of deliberate slowness that signals authority, clipboard in hand, and Brooke steps back to let him take the space that's supposed to be his. The attending physician has already explained the seizure, a febrile seizure, maybe, though Liam's temperature is normal. The labs don't show anything. The imaging doesn't show anything. Standard pediatric workup. Nothing to worry about. Everything is fine. Everything is fine except the boy hasn't spoken since his mother died and is currently staring at a nurse who works doubles without asking for overtime like she's the only person in the room who understands that some silences are survival mechanisms and some silences are prayers and sometimes they're the same thing. Captain Hayes sits beside his son's bed like he's been carved out of wood, his shoulders tight as rope, his jaw set in the way of men who've learned not to let their faces betray information that could get people killed. Brooke watches the monitors. Heart rate 92. Blood pressure 1/67. Oxygen saturation 98%. All normal. All perfectly, completely normal. Except the child is silent and the father is breaking and the other doctors are already moving on to their next patient, their next puzzle, their next case where the MRI will reveal something concrete and the treatment pathway will be clear. Brooke turns away because that's what you do when you're the ghost. You turn away. You disappear into the background. You let people forget you're there so that you can see what they're not seeing. And what she's seeing right now, standing at the threshold between the bay and the corridor where fluorescent lights hum like rotors in the distance, is that Liam Hayes doesn't have a neurological problem. He has a trauma problem. The same kind of problem Brooke had after the extraction went sideways outside Ramadi, the same kind of problem that lives in the nervous system like shrapnel, waiting for the temperature to drop or a storm to come through or a sound that reminds your body of the moment it learned that the world isn't safe. And nobody in this hospital can see it because nobody in this hospital knows what it looks like. Except the ghost. Except Brooke Sullivan, who keeps her head down and her hand steady and a patch sewn into her jacket lining like proof of a life that can never be acknowledged. Dr. Mercer makes his notes and moves on. The attending physician makes his recommendations and moves on. Captain Hayes sits beside his son's bed and the morning shift continues its slow, methodical march toward lunch and then toward evening and then toward the next morning, and Brooke Sullivan disappears back into the pediatric ward where she is safest, where she is least seen, and where a 7-year-old boy watches her leave with eyes that understand exactly what she's running from. Morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical move with the precision of a military maneuver, 10 minutes per patient, 3 residents trailing Dr. Mercer like soldiers behind a commander who has never lost a battle and never intends to. The fluorescent lights hum their constant fluorescent song above Liam Hayes' bed, and Captain Garrett Hayes sits rigid in the visitor chair, a man whose muscles remember standing at attention even when slouching. 2 days. 48 hours of inconclusive tests. MRI showing nothing. EEG showing nothing. A child whose silence has become louder than any noise the hospital can produce. Brooke stands at the periphery of the room, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her eyes on Liam while the attending physician lists his findings in the flat, clinical tone of someone describing a malfunctioning appliance. No seizure activity on the last EEG. No structural abnormalities. Vitals stable. The seizure that brought the boy here was isolated, possibly triggered by fever, possibly nothing that needs explanation. Possibly nothing at all. Dr. Mercer nods, making notes on his tablet with a stylus that moves like a weapon, precise, dismissive, final. He is tall the way successful people are tall, his white coat tailored, his hair touched with the kind of grey that photographs well in hospital directory listings. He has been at Cedar Creek for 11 years, and in that time he has built something that looks like a reputation, competent, decisive, the kind of physician that families thank with flowers and grateful tears. What he has actually built is a system. A network. An arrangement with Southeastern Medical Supply that generates $340,000 annually in phantom consultation fees that he splits with the purchasing director, a system so clean and so embedded in hospital protocol that it will take the Pentagon itself to unravel it. But that comes later. Right now, Dr. Mercer closes his tablet and turns to leave, and Brooke steps forward, her voice so quiet it almost doesn't exist in the room. The seizure might not be neurological, Doctor. The boy witnessed his mother's death 8 months ago. Trauma presents as seizures in pediatric cases. The amygdala essentially overrides the rational. Nurses don't diagnose, Miss Sullivan. His voice is the voice of a man amused by a child drawing on the walls. The residents smirk. One of them, a third-year named Chen who has made a habit of mocking Brooke's careful charting in the break room, actually covers his mouth. That's why we went to medical school and you went to, wherever it is you came from. The words land the way they are designed to land. The room tightens. Captain Hayes' jaw sets, and his hand reaches out instinctively toward his son, as if he can shield the boy from the shrapnel of social violence. Liam, mute and still, watches with the hypervigilance of a child who has learned that adults are unpredictable. Brooke takes one measured breath. She does not defend herself. She does not cite the 347 peer-reviewed studies on trauma-induced mutism in pediatric patients. She does not explain that she has sat in rooms with physicians who know her qualifications in a way that matters, in a way that cannot be erased by 3 years of invisibility. Instead, she lets one tear escape, a single tear that she does not wipe away, one that rolls down her cheek while she maintains eye contact with Dr. Mercer in a way that feels less like vulnerability and more like a weapon being loaded. Then maybe you should start listening to the one person in this room Liam actually trusts. The silence that follows has weight. It has density. It is the kind of silence that makes fluorescent lights audible, that makes the ventilator in the next room sound like something breathing that shouldn't be breathing. Dr. Mercer's face darkens at the suggestion that a 7-year-old would trust a nurse over a physician, that his medical school diploma counts for less in the eyes of a traumatized child than a woman who speaks in soft tones and does not run diagnostic tests on his fear. You're dismissed from rounds, Miss Sullivan. His voice is still level, still amused, but underneath it is something else, something that sounds like a man who has decided something. We'll discuss your scope of practice later. Brooke walks out of the room without responding. She does not slam the door. She does not cry in the stairwell. She does not do anything but absorb the isolation with the calm of someone who has already survived worse, because survival is not always loud and dramatic. Sometimes survival is just not breaking, just not showing the fractures while you walk through a hospital corridor that feels narrower than it did yesterday. By afternoon, the unit board outside the nursing station displays a formal write-up in thick red marker. The handwriting is precise, military in its geometry. B. Sullivan, unauthorized patient contact exceeding scope of practice, disciplinary action pending. It is typed, it is official, it is everything designed to make a nurse understand that she has been seen and found wanting. Brooke walks past it 3 times before she stops pretending she has not seen it. The break room is the place where the violence happens next, the kind of violence that leaves no bruises. Brooke enters at 1:15 p.m. with a lunch container that smells like the apartment she rents on Victory Drive, a quiet place decorated with nothing that might identify her as someone with a history. Chicken and rice. Black coffee. The simplicity of someone who does not require much. She sits at the table by the window, the one that overlooks the parking lot where her truck sits under a sweet gum tree, always facing outward, always ready. 3 nurses who were laughing at some story about a patient's family member, a laugh that sounded genuine, human, normal, go silent. Not the immediate silence of recognition or accident. This is coordinated silence. Chen grabs her phone as if suddenly reminded of something urgent. The pediatric charge nurse stands up with the commitment of someone executing a planned movement. They leave, and they leave behind the particular kind of emptiness that happens when people decide someone is not worth the air in the room. Brooke eats her chicken and rice. She drinks her black coffee. She does not look up. She does not check her phone. She does not do anything but sit in the silence and understand that this is the price of visibility, that being seen is the first step toward being removed. It happens again at 3:38 p.m. when she enters during shift change. Again at 5:33 p.m. when she goes in to grab her bag before clocking out. By 7:16 p.m., when she returns for the night shift, the break room has become a room that Brooke passes through like a ghost, present but unacknowledged, occupying space that other people seem determined not to occupy simultaneously. At 8:15 p.m., Dr. Mercer calls her into his office. The office smells like mahogany and ambition, like the carefully constructed spaces of people who know their way around institutional power. He has a file open on his desk, and his smile does not reach his eyes. "You've been here 3 years, Miss Sullivan." It is not a question. Brooke stands at parade ground perfect, her hands at her sides, her expression the kind of careful blank that comes from learning how to not show fear in rooms where fear is an invitation to further attack. "That's correct, Doctor. 3 years. No previous employment history. No references. Nothing in your file before 2020. He leans back in his chair, studying her the way someone studies a problem they are planning to solve. "That's unusual, wouldn't you say? Most people have a past. A trail. Something that explains who they are before they arrive asking for a job in pediatrics." The threat hangs in the air like smoke. Brooke's right hand finds her jacket lining, feels the patch through the fabric, the faded unit insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, worn from her own fingers, touching it exactly like this, in rooms exactly like this, when the walls feel like they are closing. That patch is the only proof she ever carried of who she really was. That patch is the thing that will destroy her if anyone ever looks closely enough. "I do my job, Doctor." "You do." He closes the file. "Then stick to bedpans and blood draws, Miss Sullivan. Or I'll find someone who will. Are we clear?" "Clear." She walks out and does not break stride and does not stop breathing and does not fall apart until she is in her truck at 11:02 p.m., parked under that sweet gum tree in the lot that faces outward, always ready to leave. Her hands grip the steering wheel. Her breathing is controlled. Her composure holds like a dam holds water, perfectly, until it does not. But that is not tonight. Tonight she drives home through rain that has started falling without warning, the kind of rain that hits the windshield like accusation. She thinks about a child who cannot speak. She thinks about a captain who recognized her across 8 months and 3 years and all the years that came before. She thinks about what she promised to a woman who is no longer breathing, and she thinks about the distance between being a nurse and being what she actually is, which is something that no hospital in Savannah is supposed to know. By the time she reaches her apartment, the rain has become a storm. The storm rolled in at 2:22 a.m. like an unwelcome memory made audible. Thunder split the sky above Savannah, and in her apartment 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, Brooke Sullivan's eyes snapped open in the dark. Her hand moved to her chest before her brain caught up, muscle memory from 16 years ago, from a rooftop in Ramadi where the sound of incoming artillery sounded exactly like this. The thunder came again. Closer. She sat up, breathing through her nose the way her combat medic trainer had taught her, counting, 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 6 counts out. By the 4th rotation, her heart rate stabilized from 145 to something almost normal. She was in Savannah. In civilian clothes. In a life that had no claim on her past. But the storm didn't care about her reinvention. Rain hammered against the window in waves, and she found herself standing at the glass, watching the trees bend like soldiers taking fire. The smell of ozone filled her apartment, the same metallic electricity that hung in the air after a defibrillator discharge, or after a mortar round impacted 40 meters downwind. She could taste it in the back of her mouth. Copper and voltage and the particular ghost of a place she'd promised herself she'd left behind. At 2:24 a.m., her phone vibrated. Cedar Creek Medical. The ICU night nurse's voice came tight and controlled, "We need you in. Code on the Hayes kid. Room for 08. Brooke was in her car before the nurse finished the sentence. 17 minutes to the hospital through rain that fell in sheets, visibility down to maybe 20 feet. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up. She drove like she'd driven convoy routes in Anbar province, smooth, fast, no wasted movement, scanning for angles of attack that no longer existed. Her knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The pediatric ward was chaos wrapped in the false calm of professional routine. Nurses moved with the precision of people who drilled this exact scenario 100 times, but drills weren't children. Drills didn't have fathers who looked like they'd been carved out of marble and fear. Captain Garrett Hayes stood outside room for 08, his chest heaving. He'd aged 5 years since the morning rounds. The rain had soaked him through, and his uniform, off-duty tactical pants, a polo shirt that didn't hide the scar tissue of someone who'd taken shrapnel, was plastered to a body that looked like it had been wound too tight. "He's in the bathroom," he said before Brooke made it past the threshold. His voice was fractured. "Lock the door." The storm, something about the thunder triggered him and he just. Brooke moved past him without breaking stride. The bathroom door was locked, the kind of pediatric lock that had a release mechanism on the outside for exactly this scenario. She twisted it. Nothing. The door was wedged. She could hear it, the unmistakable wet gasp of a child in respiratory distress, the high-pitched wheeze of a 7-year-old whose airway was closing. "Where's Mercer?" she asked. "Unreachable. His service says." "The on-call resident." Hayes' silence was its own answer. Brooke could see the resident through the window of the main room, Dr. Patterson, fresh out of his fellowship, standing frozen with a crash cart in reach and his hands shaking. She'd seen men freeze before. Usually just before everything fell apart. The bathroom door wouldn't give to the lock release. Brooke moved to the frame, assessed it the way she'd assessed doorways in 100 houses that weren't hers, and pushed. The hinges were cheap institutional grade. She hit it with her shoulder, and the frame splintered. The door swung inward. Liam was on the tile floor, his small body rigid, his lips a shade of blue that didn't have a name for how bad it was. His chest was heaving, the look of someone drowning in air, the throat closing down like a fist. Seizure activity had stopped, but his airway was compromised. The storm outside had triggered not just fear but a full cascade of trauma response, and his body was shutting down. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath, Brooke said, her voice already dropping into a register that sounded like someone else. Someone from another life. Size 4.0 endotracheal tube. Suction set to high. And get Patterson. Tell him to bring the crash kit. Hayes was beside his son, his hands hovering uselessly. What are you? His airway is closing. I need to create an alternative passage. Watch. She didn't wait for permission. Brooke's hands moved on their own, the way they had in a medical compound outside Fallujah when the blast had taken out the building's east wall and there was no surgeon, only her and a trauma medic who was barely functional. She'd had scissors then. She had something better now. She reached inside her jacket, the movement automatic, muscle memory deeper than thought, and retrieved the knife she carried every single day. 4 inches of stainless steel, serrated on one edge, the handle wrapped in paracord. The same blade she'd borrowed from a ranger gunner in 2019 during an extraction that went sideways, and she'd never given it back. She'd carried it through 12 years of supposed civilian life, hidden in her jacket lining next to the unit patch that proved she'd ever existed at all. You can't use that, Patterson said from the doorway, his voice climbing toward panic. That's not sterile, that's not. Brooke didn't acknowledge him. She had a lighter, standard issue in her apartment, same as the knife, and she ran the blade through the flame for 3 seconds. The heat was clean and bright. She felt the steel warm in her fingers, felt the weight of it like an old conversation in a language she'd promised not to speak anymore. Liam's oxygen saturation was dropping. She could see it in his color, in the way his small ribs were working with the desperation of a drowning victim. 64%. 61. Captain, she said, and Hayes's head snapped up at the title because he knew that voice and he didn't yet know he was hearing it. Hold his head. Steady. His neck at 45 degrees, just like that. Don't move. She palpated the anterior neck, finding the landmarks the way she'd found them 1,000 times, the thyroid notch, the cricoid cartilage below it, the space between them that was the only door when the front one was closing. She'd practiced this on mannequins as a registered nurse, but muscle memory didn't come from mannequins. Muscle memory came from screaming in the dark, from kids not much older than Liam with shrapnel in their throats and nowhere else to go. The needle went in smooth. One motion. The membrane parted like expectation. A faint hiss of air escaped, the sound of something trapped finally finding a way out. Brooke threaded the angiocath forward and withdrew the needle. The airway was patent. Open. The kid could breathe. Bag and mask, she said, and this time she didn't ask Patterson. She reached past him and took the manual ventilation bag herself, sealing it over the opening she'd just created. The first breath came smooth and controlled. The resistance told her the lungs were compliant. She could feel it in her hands, the kid's body starting to relax because his brain had gotten what it needed, oxygen. In, 4 counts. Out, 6. The cadence of keeping someone alive. Breathe, she told Liam softly, not breaking her rhythm. In Ramadi, your mom told me you were the bravest kid she'd ever met. Prove her right, soldier. Hayes's head snapped up like she'd triggered something explosive in his chest. His eyes moved to her face, and she saw the moment, the recognition of a voice he'd only ever heard giving orders in the dark, a woman whose name he wasn't supposed to know, whose service record had been erased by people who never missed. But she didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not with Liam's life balanced on the exactness of her breathing cadence. 90 seconds. That's all it took for the crash team to arrive, flooding the bathroom with the kind of organized intensity that only came from training and repetition. They brought the full setup, a real airway cart, a pediatric endotracheal tube, the whole infrastructure of a hospital that actually existed on the civilian side of the world. They took over intubating Liam properly, securing the airway the way it was supposed to be secured, running him up to ICU with monitors and saline running and every medical security blanket he should have had from the start. Brooke stepped back. Her scrubs were soaked with his blood. Not much, a field cricothyrotomy was efficient, precise, minimal hemorrhage, but enough to paint her hands red. She was still holding the knife. The on-call resident stared at the incision site like he was trying to understand a language he'd never heard. Who the hell did this? Brooke didn't answer. She was rinsing the knife in the sink, watching the blood spiral down the drain like something that had never belonged to her at all. The steel was already clean, almost sterile from the heat. She dried it on a paper towel and slipped it back into her jacket, into the place it had never really left. That's when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway. He'd come fast, summoned by the code alarm that had gone out hospital-wide. His eyes moved across the scene, the bathroom door hanging off its hinges, the blood on the tile, Brooke's saturated scrubs, the resident's expression of someone who'd watched their entire understanding of the chain of command restructure itself in 90 seconds. Then Mercer's eyes landed on her, and she watched him see it, the moment of opportunity, the perfect documentation trail, the non-approved instrument, the unauthorized procedure, the entire case file that would end her career before lunch. "Miss Sullivan," he said slowly, pulling his phone from his pocket with the deliberation of someone collecting evidence, "you just practiced medicine without a license." He took 3 photographs, the field incision, her bloody hands, the knife still visible in her jacket pocket. By 6:13 a.m., after she'd showered the blood off in the hospital bathroom and sat in the HR office in a clean set of scrubs, Brooke Sullivan was officially suspended pending investigation. The incident report was already circulating, copies to risk management, to the state nursing board, to legal. Dr. Mercer had been thorough. He'd ensured that every detail of her unauthorized procedure would be examined, questioned, prosecuted with the kind of institutional weight that crushed people like her every single day. What he didn't know was that the automatic background check, triggered by the incident report, standard protocol for any suspension, had just pinged a classified security clearance still active in Pentagon databases under a name she hadn't used in 5 years. The ICU waiting room smelled like old coffee and the particular silence that follows a code. Captain Garrett Hayes sat in a mold plastic chair facing the window to Trauma Bay 3, where his 7-year-old son breathed through a ventilator in steady mechanical rhythm, whoosh, pause, whoosh, each cycle a small mercy Hayes hadn't earned. His shoulders carried the weight of command the way other men carried scars, and right now they were folded inward like a man who'd learned the hard way that control was an illusion. Brooke emerged from the corridor at 7:04 a.m. Still in her scrubs. Still covered in blood that wasn't hers. The jacket she'd worn into the bathroom was gone, carefully disposed of in a biohazard container, but flecks of red marked her forearms like a map of what she'd done in the dark while everyone froze. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Only her eyes betrayed what the procedure had cost, that thin line of recognition between a trauma surgeon and someone who'd learned medicine in places where civilian hospitals didn't exist. Hayes turned. Didn't stand. Just pivoted his head toward her with the precision of a man trained to assess threats in 3 seconds. His eyes were the color of rain on concrete, and they held the kind of knowledge that came from watching someone break protocol and save a life with the same motion. "You saved his life," he said. Not a question. Not gratitude yet. Just fact. Brooke sat 2 chairs away, protocol distance, the gap a senior officer maintained from subordinates in public spaces. Her jaw was clean. Whoever had run cold water over her in the bathroom had done a thorough job. Only the cuticles of her fingernails still held the evidence, little crescents of dried blood beneath the nail beds. "And they're firing you for it," Hayes continued, still facing the window. Liam's small chest rose and fell behind the glass. The monitors beeped their chorus in steady 4/4 time. "It's fine," Brooke said. Hayes turned fully then, and the movement carried the weight of command ranks, of decisions made at 0300 hours that sent people like her into rooms they weren't trained to survive. "It's not fine, Captain." The rank hung in the air between them. The waiting room held 3 other families, none of them close enough to hear, all of them too exhausted to listen. But the word landed on Brooke like shrapnel from a bomb that was supposed to have been buried 5 years ago. She closed her eyes. Opened them. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed with the steady electrical hum of a system running at capacity, of a hospital that had almost lost 1 child and almost lost everything else before dawn broke. "You know," Hayes said. It wasn't a question. Brooke nodded. One small motion that contained 5 years of buried history of Black Ops extraction protocols and names that didn't exist in any database, of a wife's final letter that he'd only read after Brooke had disappeared into the grid. After the extraction went sideways in Ramadi, November 2019, the Army erased my service record, Brooke said. Her voice was steady as hands that had threaded sutures in the dark. Black Ops asset recovery doesn't exist on paper. So neither did I. They ordered me to disappear. New social security number. New identity. Told me never to surface, never to contact anyone, never to acknowledge the operations I'd run or the people I'd served with. Hayes listened the way infantry officers listened, with absolute silence that meant absolute understanding. Nursing was the only way I could still serve without existing, Brooke continued. I could keep working in medicine. Keep being useful. Keep my promise to Sarah without breaking federal law every time I talked to her. Hayes's jaw tightened at his wife's name. Sarah had been gone for 14 months. 14 months of a 7-year-old boy who wouldn't speak because his body had learned that sound was dangerous, that words couldn't save mothers, that silence was the only survival strategy left when everything else failed. Sarah's last letter, Hayes said quietly. The one she wrote when the cancer stopped responding to treatment. She mentioned you. She said if anything happened to her, if I ever needed someone I could trust with everything, I should find Reaper 6. He paused. She said you'd promised to watch over us. That you'd sworn it on your service. Brooke's composure fractured. Not dramatically. Not with trembling or collapse. Just a single tear tracking down her left cheek as her voice broke into something almost human. I'm sorry I couldn't save her. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry I couldn't. Hayes gripped her shoulder, the same way a commanding officer grips a soldier who's held the line too long. You saved my son. You saved my son. They sat like that for 17 seconds. The ventilator continued its mechanical mercy. Somewhere down the corridor, a code cart was being restocked. Someone's phone buzzed. The hospital moved on, indifferent to the moment where a captain learned that another captain had been alive all along, watching, waiting, carrying promises like weapons she never got to fire. By 11:36 a.m., Brooke was clearing out her locker on the 3rd floor. The space was small, a standard employee locker, metal grey, with a combination lock that had never really kept anyone out because hospitals ran on the assumption that theft wasn't the threat. People were. She packed methodically. Cracked coffee mug with the Cedar Creek Medical logo, chipped on the left side from the time she'd gripped it too hard during a pediatric death. Dying succulent in a plastic pot, wilted despite her attempts at hydration every Tuesday. The photograph, Sarah Hayes in dress uniform, 5 years younger, standing beside a captain's promotion ceremony, pinning the rank insignia with precision and ceremony and pride. In the photo, Brooke wore a face that didn't exist anymore. A life that had been classified and filed and erased. The other nurses moved through the locker room with the careful distance of people who'd been told not to engage with the pariah. A write-up on the unit board. An incident report flagged for investigation. A suspension pending review of unauthorized medical procedures. In hospital time, that made her radioactive. By end of shift, she'd be a cautionary tale. By week's end, she'd be a name removed from the scheduling system. Through her peripheral vision, she caught Dr. Mercer watching from his office across the corridor. He stood at the window, arms crossed, and she could see the calculations moving behind his eyes. How quickly could he replace her? How thoroughly could he document the firing? How carefully could he ensure that nobody ever examined his billing records too closely, those phantom consultations, those supply kickbacks, the way he'd built an entire secondary income stream from patient cases that never existed in any meaningful way. Brooke placed the cardboard box on the locker shelf. Folded her empty scrubs. Removed her badge, the one that identified her as Brooke Sullivan, RN, Cedar Creek Medical, and placed it in the box with the photograph on top. Sarah's smile faced upward. Expectant. The walkout took 14 minutes. Down 3 corridors. Past the ICU where Liam Hayes lay breathing with mechanical assistance. Down the elevator. Through the main lobby where the morning shift was arriving, coffee cups in hand, ready for another day of healing people without knowing the cost of the healing, without understanding what it meant when someone decided to break protocol and survive anyway. The rain hit hard. Not the gentle kind that cleaned things. The heavy kind that tested your resolve, that soaked through cotton and denim and the thin fabric of a cardboard box until everything inside began to blur. Brooke stood at the bus stop 2 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, no umbrella, no car waiting, no phone call from Hayes because he was still inside with his son and his gratitude and his understanding of what she'd risked. The photograph softened as water seeped through the cardboard. Sarah's face began to run. The date printed on the back, 5 years ago exactly, the day Brooke had received her bars, started to dissolve into ink. Brooke watched it happen and didn't move. Didn't reach for shelter. Didn't try to protect the box or its contents. This was how promises died. Not with gunfire or extraction missions or names classified beyond the reach of federal law. Not with ceremony or paperwork or official record. They died on rainy mornings in parking lots, with photographs dissolving and careers ending and women who'd carried other people's survival on their shoulders learning that nobody carried theirs. A bus pulled up. She didn't board. Instead, she stood there until the photograph was genuinely unrecognizable, until Sarah Hayes became just another image bleeding away into rain and forgetting. Behind her, Cedar Creek Medical continued its operation. Dr. Mercer continued his billing. Liam Hayes continued breathing, unaware that the woman who'd broken every rule to keep him alive had been systematically dismantled for the crime of refusing to let a child die. The next bus came at 8:41. Brooke boarded that one. She took a window seat near the back, the cardboard box on her lap, water dripping onto the floor in a rhythm that matched the mechanical beeping of a ventilator she could no longer hear. What she didn't know was that an automatic background check, triggered by the incident report, standard protocol for any suspension, had just pinged a classified security clearance still active in Pentagon databases under a name she hadn't used in 5 years. And that clearance had just generated an emergency notification to 3 different federal agencies who'd been waiting 5 years for her to surface. And that notification had just reached a Navy office in Norfolk, where a captain with old loyalties read the name and the location and reached for a phone he'd hoped never to use again. The rain hammered the bus windows. The photograph continued to dissolve. And somewhere in the Pentagon, people who'd written her name into the erasure were now writing it back into the record. Captain Hayes didn't knock. He pushed through the administrator's office door at 9:24 a.m. with the kind of controlled fury that comes from 23 years of command, and the woman behind the mahogany desk, Patricia Chen, the hospital administrator, looked up from her keyboard to find a man whose eyes held the weight of decisions made in rooms without windows. He'd spent the last 8 hours reviewing legal documents, tracing the timeline of his son's care, and understanding exactly what Brooke Sullivan had sacrificed to save Liam's life. Now he was here to collect a debt. I want her reinstated. Today. Not a request. A command. Chen's jaw tightened. Captain Hayes, the investigation into the incident is ongoing. The use of an unauthorized instrument, the scope of practice violation, is a miracle. Hayes sat without invitation. My son was seizing. His airway was collapsing. Your on-call resident froze like a recruit on his first day. Your unit director was unreachable for 43 minutes. And the only person who moved was the woman you just suspended. He leaned forward, and the air pressure in the room seemed to shift. So either you reinstate her, or I call the Pentagon directly and explain how Cedar Creek Medical suspended the only qualified trauma specialist on your entire staff for saving a child's life. Your choice. Chen's face went pale. The threat wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. She reached for her phone and made 2 calls, one to HR, one to the board chairman. By 10:15 a.m., Brooke was being notified that the suspension was under review, pending an emergency board meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. Chen wasn't going to make this easy, but she was going to make it happen. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like industrial coffee and fluorescent panic. The board chairman sat at the head of the table, the hospital attorney to his right, the CFO beside him, and Brooke in a chair that felt designed for defendants. Captain Hayes stood behind her, one hand on the back of her chair, a gesture that said everything without saying anything at all. She dressed carefully that morning, clean scrubs, hair pulled back, no jewelry except the small military watch that had survived 3 deployments. The faded Ranger unit patch remained stitched inside her white coat, hidden from everyone except the people who needed to know. The attorney began with the incident report, reading the clinical details aloud: the respiratory distress, the failed intubation attempts, the emergency cricothyrotomy performed with a field knife rather than proper surgical instruments. Then he paused and looked directly at Brooke. "What I want to understand," he said carefully, "is how a pediatric nurse knew the exact landmarks for an emergency airway procedure. That's surgeon-level knowledge. That's not taught in standard RN curricula." The room went completely silent. Brooke felt Hayes's hand tighten fractionally on her chair. Then Hayes spoke, and his voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded respect in combat zones across 4 continents, "because she's not just a nurse." He paused, letting the weight settle. Then he reached down and gripped Brooke's shoulder. "Reaper 6. The name hung in the air like a shock charge. 2 of the board members exchanged confused glances. But the chairman's face went white. Chen's hands trembled. The hospital attorney turned to his briefcase and withdrew a single document, sealed, stamped with the Department of Defense seal, declassified status approved as of 3 days prior. His voice dropped to a formal register as he read aloud. "For extraordinary heroism under fire while extracting civilian personnel from a compromised medical facility in Ramadi, Iraq, on March 14, 2019. Soldier demonstrated exceptional tactical awareness, medical proficiency under extreme duress, and commitment to mission completion despite sustaining significant injury. Actions resulted in the successful extraction of 12 civilian medical personnel and prevention of hostile capture of critical intelligence assets." He looked up. The citation goes on for another paragraph. It's signed by the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Mercer stood so fast his chair crashed backward. His face was the color of raw meat, and his voice came out in a growl. "This is obviously fabricated. There's no record of her service anywhere. No one serves in the military." And then, he stopped, understanding the trap too late. 2 FBI agents stepped through the conference room door. One carried a folder, the other wore the expression of a professional who'd spent the morning building a case. The taller agent approached Mercer with a warrant that looked substantial enough to carry its own weight. "Dr. James Mercer, we have a federal warrant to audit Cedar Creek Medical's financial records and your personnel files," the agent said. "You're not under arrest at this moment, but I'd suggest you contact an attorney." What followed was a masterclass in professional dismantling. The agents projected emails onto the conference room screen. Mercer's communications with his supply contact, a man named Victor Tran who ran medical equipment out of a warehouse in Macon, showed a pattern so blatant it was almost insulting in its arrogance. Phantom consultation fees billed to Medicaid. Equipment marked up 340% and invoiced back to the hospital for inventory that was then resold to competing facilities. Reimbursement forms for conferences Mercer never attended. Kickbacks disguised as consulting bonuses that totaled $340,000 over 18 months. When the background check flagged Captain Sullivan's Pentagon clearance, the forensic accountant explained, his pointer moving across the screen. Dr. Mercer accessed the hospital's HR database using his administrative credentials. "Here." The email appeared in real time, Mercer's user ID, timestamp 11:44 p.m., 3 minutes before Brooke was suspended. He'd modified her background check results, replacing her classified security status with a fabricated criminal record for financial fraud. The hospital's security system flagged the alteration automatically and escalated to federal authorities. "He needed her gone," the accountant continued, his tone carrying the weight of a professional who'd seen this pattern before. "She was asking too many questions. She stayed with patients too long. She reviewed supply costs. She was a threat to his timeline." The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their steady commercial prayer. Mercer's mouth moved, forming words that didn't come, his hands opening and closing like he was reaching for something that had already burned. An FBI agent stepped forward with handcuffs. "Dr. Mercer, you have the right to remain silent." The walk to the security office took them past the nurse's station. The entire pediatric unit had gathered. Word travels faster than light in hospitals, and they stood in absolute silence as Mercer was led past them in handcuffs. His face was the face of a man watching his entire existence crumble in real time. His eyes found the unit board where Brooke's write-up still hung in red marker, the words "unauthorized patient contact" visible from 15 feet away. A junior nurse named Marcus, 23 years old, still in his first year, reached out and ripped the write-up from the board. He handed it to Brooke without speaking, but his eyes said everything. The room watched as the paper was destroyed, as if watching the erasure of a lie. 6 months later, Cedar Creek Medical unveiled its new pediatric trauma program. The position of director went to a nurse with an MSN, 23 years of clinical experience, and a security clearance that suddenly stopped being classified. Brooke's office overlooked the ambulance bay, and the plaque on her door read Captain Brooke Sullivan, RN, MSN, Pediatric Trauma Director. The rank was no longer hidden. The identity was no longer erased. Dr. Mercer served 18 months in a federal minimum security facility in Allendale, South Carolina. Upon release, he took work as a driver for the medical supply company he'd once defrauded through, piloting a van with faded lettering that said TLC Equipment Solutions. He delivered boxes to hospitals across Savannah, including Cedar Creek Medical, using the service entrance where he was no longer allowed to use the main facilities. Brooke watched him sometimes through her office window, a man moving with the shuffling gait of someone who'd lost everything, but she never watched for long. There was no satisfaction in watching someone collapse under the weight of their own choices. The Ranger unit patch hung framed on her wall now, beside the declassified Silver Star citation and a photograph of Sarah in full dress uniform, Sarah's hand on Brooke's shoulder as she pinned captain's bars to her collar 5 years before everything changed. A jade plant, a thriving, green, alive, sat on the windowsill where the dying succulent used to wilt. Her mug now read "World's Okayest Trauma Director" in ironic letters, a gift from the nurses on the unit who'd finally seen the person they'd been working alongside. On a Tuesday morning in September, when the Savannah heat was starting to break and the humidity was finally allowing humans to breathe normally, Captain Garrett Hayes brought his son to Brooke's office for a routine follow-up. Liam was healthy now, thriving. He'd been seeing a trauma specialist twice a week, and the silence that had defined him for 2 years was finally breaking into sounds, laughter, questions, the ordinary noise of a 7-year-old boy learning to live again. He sat in the chair across from Brooke and studied the patch on her wall for a long moment. The Ranger's insignia caught the afternoon light. Brooke watched him examine it with the serious expression children get when they're trying to understand something important. Then, in a voice that sounded like gravel and hope mixed together, a voice unused for 2 years, raspy and fragile and absolutely clear, he spoke. "Mom had one like that." Brooke's pen stopped moving. Hayes went completely still, understanding that something significant was happening, that his son was crossing a threshold that could never be uncrossed. "She said." Liam's voice wavered but held. "She said Rangers lead the way." Brooke came around the desk and knelt in front of him, taking his small hands in her scarred ones, hands that had held lives together in Ramadi, hands that had performed emergency procedures with combat knives, hands that had learned to be gentle in a pediatric ward. "That's right, soldier. And you just took point." Hayes was crying now, and Brooke pulled them both into an embrace that smelled like hospital soap and old promises finally, fully kept. She held them there for a long moment, and no one spoke, because sometimes words aren't the point. Sometimes the point is just the silence between people who survive together. Later, walking them to the elevator, Brooke adjusted her white coat and felt the weight of the Ranger unit patch sewn into the lining. She'd moved it there from the frame, needing it close, needing the proof of who she was stitched against her heart where it mattered most. The identity that had been erased was now permanent, woven into the fabric of her uniform. A medical supply van pulled into the service entrance. Mercer climbed out, moved with the slow shuffling pace of a man who'd given up expecting better, and began unloading boxes. His eyes passed over the ambulance bay where Brooke stood with Captain Hayes and Liam, but they didn't see her. Some men, when they lose everything, learn to look at nothing. Brooke turned her attention back to Liam, who was talking quietly about soccer practice and homework and tomorrow. She watched as Hayes held his son's hand, as the boy's words came stronger with each sentence, as the two of them stepped into the elevator and disappeared upward. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit that like button. And I'd love to know, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from.